that a combination like this is surely poised to touch on dynamic areas and assess the issues from multiple important dimensions. Certainly, our audience is also keen to know, Professor Kishore, about not only the geopolitical impact, but also the socio-economic and the socio-political impact areas. Like our other webinars, we love to involve our audience. So we will be conducting polls at the end of this presentation, which a few scenarios which have been presented by our speaker, and we will have polls and we will carry on the Q&A discussion session starting from that particular question, which you all vote for. As always, we'll be glad to get your feedback on all our webinars. So please do take the poll at the end of the program as well on the webinar, and also write to us at info@covins.com. And of course, do follow social media pages as well. At the end of the webinar, you will receive a certificate of participation. So I will also ask you to please share the same on your social media pages, tagging us and letting us know your feedback on the post. So without further delay, I'm pleased to invite today's speaker, Dr. Nandakishore, to share his views on our interesting theme today. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're very clear.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Conflict being, I think somebody's microphone is on. I think I'm able to hear myself again. Yeah, this is fine. Yeah, what I intend to do is not everything under the sun can be covered this evening with regard to when we talk about conflicts. So I would restrict myself to few of them, and you will see that what exactly I'm trying to do in coming few minutes, and that probably I'll also love to take questions here. Give me a second. I'm just putting on the speaker here for a second. Yeah. So can we have the presentation, please, so that it's much easier for us to go ahead with. So as you can see here, the format of the presentation is, I've kept it very simple. There's a bit of introduction to armed conflicts, because when I say armed conflicts, it's much easier because otherwise conflicts can range into a lot of things, including that of domestic violence that happens in a family also is conflict, and there are many dimensions to it. So I've largely kept it to armed conflicts. Violent conflicts are something that I'm trying to look at. We'll just look at a bit of characteristics, dynamics, and the impact that it does in different parts of the world, and then a bit of conflict analysis of the cases that I'm going to take this evening. That's something that I'm planning to do. Now, just a second, yeah. So this is a simple map that you can see here. The type of conflicts that we have all over the world. We have, starting off to the closest in South Asia, we have Afghanistan. We also have Myanmar. And then after that, you see a range of them happening in Africa and West Asia or Middle East, that others tend to call it. So you have Syria, you have Iraq, you have Sudan, Yemen, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, Burundi, Congo, then Central African Republic, then you have Cameroon, Nigeria, Niger. You name some of this, and some of them are extremely important, and they've also been geopolitically very, very relevant. As Dr. Vignesh was telling, I'm grateful to his organization for inviting me to be in this particular webinar and share whatever the minimal I know with all of you. They asked me specifically to concentrate on few of the cases so that we don't end up going to too many of them, but at the same time we give adequate importance to few and then discuss in little detail how they have been facing at this juncture when the COVID-19 crisis is there. Has it made any difference at all is something that we try to look at this point of time. Now, as I keep telling, that understanding violent conflicts is a very important scenario that we have to remember here, because there is no single cause. That is the interesting component. Okay, because there is nothing called as a single cause also for a conflict, because if you look in, across the world, there are certain limitations to the way people look at causal relations. People tend to think that there is a single reason due to which something is happening. You take example of any country for that matter. If you have to take simplest of them, like what is happening in Afghanistan now, if there is anyone who can pin out to single reason, perhaps it's not a possibility. It's something that people have not been able to do, and it's been a failure for a very long time. That is the reason we keep telling there is no single cause for conflict or of conflict as such, but conflict is context specific, multi-causal, multi-dimensional, and also can result from a combination of the following factors that I have brought in here. I've tried bringing quite a few of them there. I'm sure some of you can actually add to a few of them, and there might be many more that we also see. So we have the political and institutional factors, which are very, very important, where you have weak state institutions. Now, when I say weak state institutions, it's about the governance structure. You have limitations of some of these governance structures who are not able to fulfill to the requirements of what we call as governance. On the one hand, where their capacity to rule is comparatively weak. That can happen from let's say the elite power struggle that is happening in the nation, or sort of political exclusion as well. There is no single way of saying about it. It can even be breakdown in social contract and corruption. When I say breakdown in social contract, the state moving from its original position on which it had promised certain things. The state, which more so in the democratic tradition, they're supposed to be, let's say, welfare states. Okay, now something is being promised and something is not being delivered. Now, why I say that? It is important because of the simple reason that whenever we look at certain components of governance, and then we look at a welfare state, there is always something called as the principal agent problem. Now, what is principal agent problem? It is essentially where a political party promises something, but then it's unable to deliver. It struggles to deliver, and then it ends up doing something else which is not acceptable or which is not accepted by the public. So that's where the breakdown of the social contract happens. You're unable to deliver governance. It can lead to civil wars. It can lead to many other things. Then the other important factor is identity politics. I'm sure there is one of my student and a scholar, a PhD scholar by name Mr. Nadeem. He is there today, I think so. He is actually working on his PhD on identity politics. Now, identity politics in West Asia, one of the main conflict zones that we look at, is very, very crucial. When we talk about identity politics, it's multi-layered. It's not a single way of looking at what is an identity. Identity can be from religion, identity can be from sect, identity can be simply coming or emanating from your political affiliation. So each identity is different, and there is nothing called a single identity our individual possesses in many of these conflict zones. That is a major problem that we see. Then at the next level, we have the socio-economic factors, in which we look at inequality, exclusion, marginalization, absence or weakening of social cohesion, and as well as poverty. Now, if you ask me, most of the people would end up telling you, when I ask about, let's say, what's happening in many of the African nations, not the North African, they're comparatively rich, but further down, if you go to some of these African nations, people would simply say that there is massive inequality. That inequality is arising from poverty, and that poverty is actually leading to exclusion, and that exclusion is also something that is resulting in marginalization. Now, that is how they would simply talk about. That is the problem that one needs to understand at this juncture. Next one is the resource and environmental factors, where greed, scarcity of resources and other things that are available for people. When the national resource becomes in or stays in abundance, that is also a problem. When there is scarcity, that's also a problem. For a lot of African nations, actually, it's a resource curse, because they have a lot of resource, there is a lot of conflict, there are too many players who get involved into. That is another sort of a problem that we regularly find. So you have such type of problems are also coming in there, leading to environmental insecurity, and then unjust resource exploitation. You have regions where let's say an extra regional park comes in and then they want to exploit, because in their nation they may not get permission to do so. So they think this is an opportunity that they can utilize and then they can bring into. So 3 layered ways of looking at conflict and armed conflict as such: violence and armed conflict, political and institutional factors, socio-economic factors, and resource and environmental management is the next way we look at. Now, moving on to the next slide, actually, what I've tried bringing in here is a scenario that happened on the 23rd of March. The UN General Secretary called for a global coronavirus ceasefire. Now, this is a very important intervention because one of the UN agencies which is under surveillance, which is under severe criticism, WHO, could not act upon this particular problem at the earliest. Now, that brought an extreme stress on the governance model, where people started asking, is there anything called global governance? Are we failing? Are there any actors left? Are we moving into some sort of an hyper anarchy? Though we understand there is a constant anarchy in international relations with regard to when you don't have an international government. Here is a case where people are looking, and people started talking about saying that if the United Nations, the organizations that are associated with the United Nations, start failing the public across the world, they don't keep them in loop, what would be the outcome? Was something that was spoken about. So this is a typical problem due to which UN Secretary General himself had to intervene, and then he said, let's at least have some truce, let's have peace, let's have ceasefire. Now, the idea was that the truce will allow pandemic response to be carried out in areas that are usually too dangerous for medical personnel to access due to ongoing conflict. Now, what if people simply think that there is a problem, and then they make it more and more problematic for the medical personnel to reach? You have Doctors Without Borders, you have umpteen number of people who actually volunteer to go to even the conflict zones. And some of them go out of compulsion. That's a different case altogether. But it becomes very problematic at the end of the day from the human security perspective. Then it also could create opportunities for negotiations between the belligerents, was also something that was thought about. Now, what if for a moment there is ceasefire, there is no violence? Is there a possibility to negotiate? Does it give time for people to rethink what they're up to? What have they done to their own nations? What have they done to their own regions? Is something that there was an anticipation in the UN that it may bring in. But unfortunately, if you look in, now out of the 43 countries where there have been at least 50 reported events of organized violence this year itself, from 2020, beginning of the 2020, only 10 actors actually welcomed the call and declared unilateral ceasefire. We will see one of the cases that we have is also something that comes under the ceasefire. And they also spoke about or establish some sort of a mutual ceasefire agreement. Now, of the 31 countries, not only did the conflict actors fail to take steps to meet the call, many actually increased rates of organized violence, such as in Mexico, Iraq, Mozambique, and Brazil. Now, unfortunately, I'm not doing all the 4 of them today. Invariably, it would come in one or the other form, but we're not concentrating many of those. Probably times to come, we shall certainly concentrate on each of the continents, and we can take up. Probably this is something that I can appeal to the organizers to do, that we can go continent-wise and look at little more deeply on each of those conflicts, because in the paucity of time, we may not be able to do a lot of these ones which require. Now, there have been some positive responses, mostly are simple statements or saying that we will not have violence or anything of that sort, but unfortunately, there are no such strong commitments that have been made at this juncture. Now, those groups that have taken action have done so unilaterally with varying levels of commitment. You know, the way Saudi Arabia did with regard to Yemen, and many others they have done, though they themselves know that it might not be a possibility to sustain for a longer time. Now, coming specifically to the pandemic as such, it has somehow created a new scenario for people, where it also presents an extreme, strainful public health challenge and a challenge to the global economy. From the governance perspective, if you look in, no state at this juncture is in a position to ignore economic constraints that can happen along with the pandemics, or for that matter, any of the public health outbreaks. Now, for that matter, India itself, if you look in, all of us were under the lockdown, and extremely it was successful in our country from the 24th of March, when the lockdown started, till the mid of April. If you look in, it was really successful, and then subsequently, slowly and steadily, they started easing out. Now the things look actually out of control, for the simple reason the economic constraints will always push us to think beyond. The economic constraints will also make us to take certain steps which might not be very, very conducive, because there is no possibility you can stop globalization. There's no possibility you can stop the liquidification of the money that people have. In one or the other way, there has to be some sort of a rotation. Otherwise, the states will go bankrupt, and it becomes very, very problematic. If let's say for 2 months, 3 months, if something happens, it can be very, very problematic. That is something that people need to understand here. Now, its political consequences, both whether it's short term or long term, are very well understood. Everybody is now realizing that this is something that we need to live with. But at the same time, how exactly we can manage is a question that people have to try understanding at this juncture. Now, there is another important problem that we look at, where it is playing a havoc on the fragile states. Now, what are fragile states? We have partially looked at where the conflicts are in extreme conditions. Now, I no point of time I'm trying to say that the conflict conditions are the sole reasons to be calling somebody as fragile state. Certainly not. It depends on their economy. It also depends on the type of politics that they're able to play. Third, at the international level, how are they respected? Now, keeping these three parameters, then we have to call probably a conflict-ridden zone as a fragile state. Okay. Now, trigger widespread unrest. That is another major problem. If we look at the conflict cycle or conflict analysis, if we have to do, we start with looking at what exactly are the triggers. There can be multiple triggers that happen. So we look at triggers as very important tools while analyzing conflict itself. And then what happens is finally it ends up resulting in looking at what type of crisis management systems are in place. Because in normal times, there is somebody or the other who comes in. Many a times we may not even bother about, should we think about where is Yemen, what is the problem there, where is Syria, where is Iraq, where is Afghanistan, or for that matter, where is Libya. So we may not bother about, but in times when we have time to think about, we end up thinking that if the world talks about having superpowers, great powers, and all sorts of powers, we don't even have control over some of the crises that is happening, conflicts that are happening. What type of crisis management systems are available in place? Now, its implications are especially serious for those caught in the midst of the conflict, as we are aware of it, because once the disease disrupts the humanitarian aid flow, there is very limited space for operations. Then the whole idea of the diplomacy gets disrupted, or it will not have any sort of a value, because there are umpteen number of people in the world, even during this particular crisis, who are displaced. Okay, whether it is Syria, whether it is Libya, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Afghanistan, all over the world, from African nations, you also look at Somalia, Congo, many other places. The number of refugees pose a different type of threat, because providing them security, more so on the medical security, is not an easy job that can be done. So here it opens up, what are we up to in global governance? That is something that we need to rethink about, where the humanity is leading to, what is happening to the global governance concept. Now, many other leaders who are least bothered about what's happening around them, who have extreme level of national interest and self-interest, may exploit this particular pandemic, which is also happening, to advance their own objectives in ways that makes this particular crisis, whether domestic level or at the international level. They take this also as an opportunity. If you have, let's say, dissent, those people who are dissenting within the nation, this is the best time probably that crack on them, and then make sure that you escalate the conflict to a different level where the regular parties who take pot shots at you will not be in a position to say anything. So this is the best way to utilize, because they're also scared. They're not sending their people to come and either intervene or try sending their troops or anything of that sort. Even UN has to think twice before doing anything in situations like pandemic, where they can't risk the people who are in the forefront to give security to the people. Now that is something that we also remember. Now, what else has the COVID-19 has done is it has fueled geopolitical friction. On the one hand, you have the US constantly blaming China for the disease, whereas China trying to win its friend by trying to give a lot of offerings in terms of aid, medical diplomacy, everything that's possible. It's trying to do, but unfortunately, things are not as good as they imagined in the previous times. Now, COVID-19 conflict zones in discussion for today, I'm trying to look at Syria and Yemen in West Asia or Middle East that we look at, Libya from North Africa, and Afghanistan here. But needless to say, I'm not going to stop any of you from asking questions on any other if you have time. We can certainly delve upon. But what I thought was this is easy for us, or this is enough for us to just look in some of these case studies in a little deeper and in-depth manner in the limited time that we have, and then we can think about many of the things that are happening in and around. Now, what is exactly the type of condition that we have in Syria? Now, I'm not going too deep into explain how the conflict happened, who were the actors. I'm pretty sure those of you who are keen partially are aware how it started. Now we are actually reaching a different stage altogether with regard to Syria, right? It started in 2011 and now it's already 2020. There's no headway at all. A lot of things have happened in between and things are getting more and more problematic, right? Now, the ceasefire was reached by Putin and Erdogan on the 6th of March, but at the same time, when the people thought, okay, now will there be a peace that is going to take over the region? That's the time the coronavirus came in, or the COVID-19 came in. 9 years into the civil war, we know the way it has happened. It is civil, I put it in the brackets because it is a war, it is also a civil war. It's a war of different nature altogether. The Syrians have fought the ISIS has fought the Syrians, and there are too many other international players who are coming. Here is a scenario where Syria is in an extraordinarily poor position to confront COVID-19 pandemic. You can imagine a nation like India is so disturbed with regard to when there are no such major disruptions, there are no major conflicts, they are not combating anything too problematic. But India itself is in a terrible position. Forget India, United States, a superpower which spends so much of money, today has no answer. What have they done to? And their numbers are staggering. It has crossed 1 lakh. Deaths of 1 lakh. So you can look at what's happening to Brazil, what's happening to UK. All of these are showing some sort of a mirror. This is a time for introspection. So you can imagine a war-torn nation, a nation that's going through civil war for not 1 or 2 or half a decade, but almost closer to 9 years, and 9 to 10 years. It's the same thing that's happening. How are they actually dealing with it is a very interesting case. Now, instead of the pandemic leading Syria towards some sort of unification on the local, regional, international actors involved in the common issue of fighting in Syria, the dynamics in conflicts has actually hampered the whole process itself. That is the problem. So there is no effective response. Fortunately, the cases are also not too many. That's one good thing about Syria, but at the same time, it takes no time. India, if you look in somewhere around the 18th or 20th of April, we weren't sure whether this is the number that we would have. The number of cases that have risen last few days, or let's say last 20 days, is staggering. It's so problematic that people are really worried about in India. Now, that's the same case with regard to Syria, small nation, torn in conflict, leadership crisis, too many problems to handle, Now nobody wants to come and invest. Nobody wants to come and show their prowess there in the region. No extra regional power wants to come. How would they going to, or how will they actually manage? Is a very critical scenario that we are looking at. Now, in the midterm, the relevant actors are likely to continue to follow their own strategic interests in Syria. That means I'm not trying to say those who come from elsewhere, but there are too many other stakeholders who are there inside. So they will keep adjusting their own operational priorities and strategies to do so because of the pandemic, because they're not going to leave. If they immediately leave, then it will show their weakening position. That they're not going to do. But how are they going to deal with it is a very interesting component that we look at here. Now, cooperation among external actors in solving the conflict is not set to get anywhere easier, which is very clear. And trends of destabilization and erosion of state capacity in the war-torn country are also likely to continue. That's my hunch from the type of readings and the type of reporting that comes in. Is not going to change anything here. Now, at the same time in Syria, IS attacks against both Syrian regime and the Syrian Democratic Forces have also increased in April after the pandemic broke. It has gone to a different level altogether. In many places, they are even telling that it has doubled than March. At least March 6th, the ceasefire was called and there was a respite and people thought things would change. But unfortunately, in April, it has risen to a different level. The twofold increase could also mean that IS has carved out some sort of a breathing space because of non-existent Russian soldiers as well as others who were the stakeholders. Probably now it thinks, I think this is the best time to regroup, and there is a scenario that is there. So in fact, I came across that how the states are releasing COVID-related news, saying that these are the things, precautions that you people have to take. Even ISIS has released based on Quran. It's not about the modern day, wear that one, wear this one, but they have said, quoting the Quran, how you have to take care when there is a disease and when there is some sort of a pandemic or something that comes in, how you have to take care of yourself. That was very interesting for me to look in, and ISIS has done that one. So they think this is the fertile situation that they can utilize, and then they can continue their attack and regain control over many of the regions that they have lost. Now, during the first week of May, 5 IS attacks against the regime and the forces were also reported. Now, these attacks are likely to continue in the coming weeks, which we can easily anticipate. Now, elsewhere in Syria, Israel has also launched. This is something that's pathetic, though I've always said that in this particular region, each of them, nobody can be said that they're perfect or anything of that sort. But in times of crisis like this, probably, though I understand that there are other actors who are also trying to use this one to attack Israel and other things, but Israel as a state should have probably refrained itself. But unfortunately, it's also behaving in a different manner. They've launched airstrikes. Now, it's only 2 days ago that they've got a government, and this government has also come to make sure that their rhetorics continue, and both of them are very strong leaders. We know about Bibi, we also know about Gantz. So both of them are such leaders that they would not succumb to any sort of pressure. Now, here is the scenario. They think probably anything that is Iran backed, anything that is provoked on them, either from Syria or from the Hezbollah or anyone, they would want to probably destroy. So that's where their idea is coming in. So anything that pro-militia, that is pro-Iranian militia that's there, they think that this is the time that they need to attack and probably get rid of them. Otherwise, they may do something that Israel is probably fearing at a different level. What if these people are sending people to spread the pandemic? All sorts of ideas are there in them. That is the reason they're also trying to go a little overboard at this juncture. Now, while the number of airstrikes have varied throughout this particular period, the geographical spread has expanded, including Aleppo as well as Homs. That is probably now Israel thinks, I think, that there will not be too many reporting on Israel's offense. And this is the time that it thinks probably can teach a lesson to Syria. I really don't know what is running in the leader's mind, or the military itself is trying to take some drastic measures it thinks is validated. We don't know what exactly is the thing. Now, in southern Syria, the regime's arrests of former fighters and civilians led to increasing fighting between the regime forces and the former opposition fighters in Dara. Now, this has exacerbated the tense security situation that may lead to a rise in regime military operations in the area itself. Now, meanwhile, there is also another rift that comes in. Now, I'm talking about a few things here that are largely to do with the geopolitical reasoning, but at the same time, we can also think about the number of refugees who are trying to cross over to Turkey. Now, Turkey is carrying out its own offense on Syria by naming that there are Turkish fighters who want to trouble this in Turkey, and they need to do this one. Now how are this going to get resolved is also something that is very interesting. In the Idlib area, they're carrying out heavy attacks on them. So how are they going to deal is a very interesting scenario that we have to look at. Now, the refugee crisis is deepening. Humanitarian assistance is not reaching them on time, and unlike before, where at least some brave media personnel used to go and cover, that is not happening. So whatever is being sent by somebody else sitting there through mobiles and other things, they're able to put up. But still, probably the world is so engrossed with the COVID-19 crisis that these type of problems that are also associated with the COVID-19 are not taken into consideration. Somehow they don't think this is so important news to be reporting, because now they think everywhere people are dying, what's the big deal about Syria? That's the sort of feeling that's coming in. So it's a major humanitarian crisis when you have the refugee crisis also joining the business. That's a big issue. Now, as I was just reading the next one, there is also a rift in Syria's ruling al-Assad family that has also resulted in arresting some people from a particular business group, and it has also led to different type of problem, because if he is going to attack certain business tycoons and others, and they are going to fund probably the opposing groups, they are going to fund the rebels, and how they are going to take care of it is a major case of concern. So if the Kurdish population on the one hand thinks this is an opportunity to stay in Syria and then do something on Turkey, the Turkish army or Turkey itself thinks this is the right time to continue the assault. They are also doing. Assad has no say in this whole regard, because there was also this particular news where they spoke about that Russia, Turkey, and Iran are actually thinking, because of the prolonged civil war, that why don't they try to change the leadership? If that is going to be, that's one of the scenarios that I've given, probably like a conclusion also, you can look at that one. What is going to happen in that case? If regime change is a solution, they think after 9 years, after being so strong and staying with Assad, and Assad also thinking that these are the people who are going to save him, what is going to happen? Is it that Assad did not listen to them on certain issues and due to which they have done this one? What exactly is the concern is something that we may have to just try look at. Now, this is the political violence. If you look in between March 2019 to March 2020, you look at some of those regions where so the battles are happening, you have the explosion and remote violence that is happening. Rights are comparatively low. If you look in, protests have also gone down to a large extent. You don't see such type of problem in this one, but still the regions which are extremely dark is something that you can see here. Again, apart from the extreme dark part, the northern part, if you look in, slowly again the ISIS is consolidating, and ISIS will actually look for an opportunity, because Raqqa was their capital. So now they will certainly look for an opportunity to have a greater say within Syria, and they would want to continue and consolidate themselves in the coming days. This is also another this thing that you look at the type of problems that existed, where all different groups that are there, what type of consolidations that were happening, the different operations that were carried out, and what exactly type of results that it has fetched is an interesting one. You can look at. Probably will move further to the next item itself here. The next one that I'm trying to talk about is Yemen. Now, having known some of you who have attended Dr. Vignesh's webinar are aware that he partially touched upon some of these ones, but I thought a little more this thing looking into this is always a good thing too, because there is a rising violence that is happening. We look at how the conflict escalation is happening. But whatever might be, or whosoever is the stakeholder, there are massive threats for the civilians. Now you can see how vulnerable they are in this particular scenario itself, that we probably deal with a little more. Now it's been for decades, it's in trouble. There's no respite from the problem at all. But now due to the ongoing civil war, it has also witnessed one of the worst humanitarian crises. And there is a certain amount of racism in this one. There is a certain amount of identity politics in this one. There is also a certain amount of negligence that has been shown, and the display of some sort of an ugly power or ugly display of weapons and other things that's been happening in this particular region itself. It has left thousands and thousands of people internally displaced. It has also led to deaths of thousands of people. That is the problem. In last 5 years, actually, the Iran-Saudi rivalry has intensified with regard to Yemen itself. Now we know that post 79, we always had the rivalry between Iran and other Arab states that was existing. Now the dynamics are changing to an extent, but Saudi continues to think this is important. This more so happened in 2018 when the 2015 it started off when MBS or Mohammed bin Salman was made the defense minister, and then he wanted to prove his mettle. He wanted to show that what he is capable of than many of his other cousins. And then he thought this is an opportunity that he needs to utilize, and then he needs to bring in some amount of value. There are some who tend to say that probably the way he handled this whole crisis was the reason that there was a sudden change, and then he was brought in 2018 as the crown prince. So we really don't know what exactly the reason, but yet he's trying to show all his prowess, all his strength in this particular place. So there's a unilateral ceasefire that has been led by Saudi Arabia, where UAE is also one of the stakeholder. But unfortunately, what has happened to this one? What do these ceasefires really mean, actually? Particularly as the coronavirus is ravaging the whole region itself, what exactly this means? Now, Yemen has a history of fractured polity, now leading to sort of tribal clashes, and then you have also got terrorist organization. Now, imagine you already have sectarian violence, you already have race-related violence, you have tribes-related violence, you have every other thing that is already existing on top of it, like a cream. You also have terrorist organization, whether it is ISIS or, for that matter, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now that has made Yemen's condition precarious. Now, a lot of people think that Yemen is a fertile ground that anybody can go and flourish, especially if they are non-violent, if they are violent non-state actors. That's the best thing to do. As a result, what has happened? The country is undergoing massive humanitarian crisis due to the internal displacement of the people in large scale, and people have just no clue. Again, the question comes in here is, what is the UN doing? What are these great powers are trying to do? If somebody is showing his strength and power of what he is capable and trying to pull out an offense in a neighboring country, what are they trying to do? Okay, Iran, we can understand. Iran doesn't listen to anyone. Iran is very problematic. Iran doesn't care for a lot of things. At least, how could they not control Saudi Arabia? Is very interesting. And if Saudi Arabia is controlled, naturally UAE comes under control. That is something that has not happened at all. So the recent figures from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, this is the societal factor that Dr. Vignesh had asked me to talk about. Over 80% have been displaced for more than a year. In 2019 itself, the death toll in Yemen crossed actually 100,000 since the war began 5 years ago. It included 12,000 civilian casualties, if you look in. And these are some of the data that have been provided by some of the very, very reliable sort of agencies. That includes the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is also called as the ACLED. Now, the principal power struggle lies between the UN-recognized governments of Mansour Hadi, supported by Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. On the other hand, you have the Iranian-backed Houthis. Now, this particular grouping, or the Houthis, belong to the Zaidi sect of the Shias, which comprises nearly 40% of the Yemeni population. In Syria, I forgot to tell you people that Assad belongs to another sect within the Shia, which is called as the Alawite. He's an Alawite Shia ruling a majority Sunni country, whereas here is a case where these people comprise almost 40% of the population. If not majority, at least 40% is a very, very decent number, and they have been having this particular problem for a very, very long time. Now, under the Al-Ahmar family, Zaydis had ruled over the northern Yemen for almost a millennium before being overthrown in a coup in 1962. That's a bit of history, I thought, because Yemen is a little precarious case that we look at. Now, for the next 3 decades, and those people who were there in some of the top positions of the social pyramid were marginalized both politically as well as economically with the government. Finally, which led to some sort of a creation of Ansar Allah movement founded by Muhammad Badr Andil Houthi along with Muhammad Izan. Now, this is an important case because I had spoken to you people about marginalization. I had spoken about social identity. I had also spoken about several other political reasons in the beginning while categorizing conflict. Now, what I expect all of you to do is to look at these cases and try fitting them into the categorization that we had. So it brings some amount of academic value rather than largely, or rather than simply looking at the whole conflict as such. If you categorize them, you do it a little more systematically. It brings a method to it, which is very interesting. Once you are able to look at the methods, then you can deconstruct the whole conflict scenario, which gives you a better understanding of the problem itself. With that, actually, the movement soon turned into an armed movement, which carried out extensive military campaigns during 2002 to 2009 in the hope of securing greater political participation. Because for them, it was very, very important. Without getting that political participation, that's why we say across any conflict for that matter is political. Whatever they say, it is at the societal level. They may tell hundreds of things, but it is political by nature for the simple reason because they want political power at the end of the day. How do you change public policy? How do you change the political landscape without having political power? So it is essentially, conflict itself is essentially political. With that alone, they can take forward their objectives and they can get anything that they want to be fulfilled. Now, the Houthis actually achieved a breakthrough in September 2014 when they captured the capital Sana'a and placed President Hadi under house arrest. But later in January 2015, he resigned and escaped to Saudi Arabia. That's when actually it started becoming much more problematic. He appealed to the international community to restore his elected government. He started to make it look like he has been overthrown. There is massive threat. There is fear of persecution to all sorts of things, due to which this gave rise to the Saudi Arabians coming in. There are let's say conspiracy theories which says that Saudi Arabia itself told that you come over here so that we can create a scene across and then make it to look like that you came and asked refuge with us, and we have been forced in one or the other way to actually go in and then look at what can be done, and then we will intervene. So this is a conspiracy theory. There are no definitive ways of saying that this is exactly what happened there, but people tend to say this one. Now, as a result, in March 2015, an alliance led by Saudi Arabia and UAE and comprising of several other Arab countries with logistics and intelligence support from the US, this is also a confirmed source, commenced the military campaign against Iranian-backed Houthi militia in Yemen. Now, for simple reason, anything that happens which is associated with Iran, the United States will invariably come. They don't even bother about whether they have been their enemies for a long time. If tomorrow North Korea says that they're going to fight Iranians, they will fund North Korea also. That's the attitude that we have with the Americans. Now, this particular intervention significantly complicated the prospects for peace itself, because if there was possibility of a regime change and the Houthis, there was a possibility of international community coming together and trying to talk or negotiate with them, things could have been actually different. But unfortunately, it did not happen in that way. Now, what happened? It suddenly became an international conflict. conflict. Something of a simple civil war that was happening due to identity crisis, and that was more internal, now became international. Now you had too many people getting involved. Everybody wanted to show who's the best in this one. So now Iran started directly getting involved, Saudis started getting involved, and every other group started getting involved in a different manner altogether. So it became multi-dimensional regional crisis. It did not stop just with the state, but it became a regional one. Now it has become international one for that matter. Now, what makes it even more difficult to find any solution to the problem is that each faction has its vision for the future of Yemen. Now, nobody wants to give up. Every other person thinks that I have the best vision, and I'm a nationalist, so I want to take care of this one. That's where things get much more problematic and precarious. That's where Yemen's crisis is very, very problematic. Now, in a war-ravaged country that continues to fight the bloody civil war, advent of the COVID-19 has exposed the Yemenis to a completely new set of challenges. Now, till now, they were somehow managing to stay and being ravaged, whatever that is, with minimal medical help and other things, they were able to manage. Now, here is not a case that way. You don't know what's going to happen, who's actually doing what, and there's that minimal international help that was coming, even that is gone. So who's going to be responsible is a major case of concern when we talk about COVID-19 and the conflict zones. Now, though the country has seen only one confirmed case so far, and now probably few more since the date we tracked this one, the lack of testing facilities, no other medical facility that are available. You can imagine the internally displaced people and the refugees. Who's bothered about? Now, the rich class, either they have flown into a few other places. There are many others who get minimum this thing because of their own power. But many others, where would they go? All these powerless people. Now you can imagine in Indian scenario also, right? You have people who are able to do some time ago or a few days ago. Those people who could pay an expensive money to the railways could travel from Delhi to Trivandrum. What would actually these people do? Many of these people who cannot register online, who are still not very well versed, they're digitally crippled or digitally not so enabled like many of us. How would they actually register, whether it is a Seva Sindhu or whatever that is, to go back to their places? Now, this is a major case of concern that we need to address. As a state, it's very, very important for us to think about. Now, because these things were not enabling, people started going on road, people started going on tracks, people started going in different type of problem. Now, we are trying to highlight the problem, but is that the solution? Is something that we need to think. So, if that's the case with a well-governed state like India, you can imagine what's exactly happening in a country like Yemen. Now, the Saudi-led coalition announced a 2-week ceasefire, which we spoke about on the 9th of April. Now, in response, the Houthi spokesperson, Mohammed al-Bukhati, stated that we will continue to fight and target their military installations and industrial sites. Since they continue with the siege, there has to be total end of siege, or else the war will continue. This is the threat that they're giving even at time of crisis. Now, Iran so far has not taken any official position on the ceasefire itself because it does not want to make it to look open to say that they are directly involved and they're trying to do something like that to escalate their situation, because they themselves are into such regimes. It's very, very problematic. But however, Hosseini Amir Abdulnia, the senior foreign policy advisor to the Iranian parliament, had stated, saying that ending strikes in Yemen is a good move, but the unsustainability Saudi initiated someday truce is not the solution. That's what he made a statement saying that probably this is all a selfish game that they're playing, but they're not really interested in the ceasefire or anything, but they just don't want to sacrifice their soldiers. That's why they're trying to do many of these things, was something that most of the people or policymakers actually spoke about. Now, the Houthis have also alleged that despite the declaration of the ceasefire, airstrikes have been continuing. That's what they're telling. On the one hand, they're telling there is a ceasefire, but it's still happening. They want more guarantees from the UN that the other side will not exploit the withdrawal. Is something that they are looking forward to. We don't know whether we'll certainly be able to arrive at that sort of a scenario. Now, the next one that I'm trying to look at is Libya, where the civil war in Libya is in danger of intensifying as foreign intervention has grown manifold, and the pandemic is adding another level of insecurity. Now, the head of the UN support mission in Libya, which is also called as the UNSMIL, told the Security Council on this particular Tuesday itself. Now, at the same time, an alarming military buildup is underway as foreign backers and increasingly sophisticated and lethal weapons. In this one, this is an ugly scenario. I, along with one of my students, had written about the neo-Ottoman dreams of Erdogan, in which you will see we have also covered some components, how the Russians are directly involved. Russians have sold weapons, Russians have given drones, Russians have done everything that's possible in Libya. So if some of you are interested, you can as well look into that one. That will give you a little more detailed understanding of what exactly is happening in Libya, what is GNA, what is LNA, what is all happening there is something that we will understand. Now, on the one hand, we have a UN recognized government, that is the government of the National Accord, GNA. On the other hand, we have someone who's taking claim, saying that he is the one who should be the ruler, or he should be the one who should take part. There is from the Libyan National Army, which is LNA, that is General Khalifa Haftar. There's a whole story about it. I think we're running short of time. We shouldn't be spending on that one. So I'll not go in deep into looking at each of those issues. As I told you, people can read a little on that one. Now, forces affiliated with the Libyan Arab armed forces under the command of Khalifa Haftar have increased their shelling of residential neighbors close to the front lines in the southern suburbs of Tripoli. Now, this is where the fight for the Tripoli is happening. People are contesting claims, and then you have international players who are pitching in. You have Turkey that is supporting GNA, you have Russia that's supporting the LNA. On the other hand, you have Syria, where Turkey, Iran, and Russia are coming together to fight something. Here is a case where they have different interests. That's why there are no permanent enemies, nor you have permanent friends. You only have permanent interests. So interest becomes primordial. Interest alone drives all these people to do this one. That's why in one region, in one continent, if they are rivals, in another continent, they are friends. That's a sort of scenario that we are able to see here. Now, the UN says that Haftar's forces, who get most of their military support from the UAE, that's how the covering comes in, because they can't directly blame Russia. If they blame Russia, they know what will be given back to the UN. So that's why they don't do that one. They say that has inflicted vast majority of civilian casualties in the first 3 months of the year. Meanwhile, the government of the GNA and the affiliated forces, supported mostly by Turkey, have made major advances since mid-April, because there is a maritime understanding agreement that has been done between Libya and Turkey. But unfortunately, there are no changing methods that we are able to witness here also. Now, in the past also, they have failed to ensure that there are no civilian adjacents to the military facilities they targeted, heightening the risk of the civilian harm at this juncture when the condition is very, very problematic. This is the Battle of Tripoli. You can see here something that was happening in the last part of March, and then subsequently in the first week of April, you see the type of troops that are there, and the type of conflicts that are engulfing, and everybody wants to take a pie in the Libyan conflict itself. If you look in. Now, coming to Afghanistan, another important one, because the Libyan crisis hasn't gone beyond control with regard to the pandemic, but in the days to come, there are all possibilities, because you have different players playing different type of game. So we will wait and watch. There is not too much about it, but the conflict is still very, very heavy in this particular region itself. Now, on the 1st of April, if we look in with regard to, the Taliban announced that it is prepared to stop fighting in areas under its control and that are impacted by coronavirus, but somehow did not agree for a full ceasefire with the Afghan government. This is something that was reported by the Associated Press in the 1st of April. And then subsequently, Al Jazeera reported on the 6th of April by saying Taliban members have reportedly been seen wearing medical gear and providing workshops on preventing the spread of the virus itself. Now, as such, because the pandemic is not going to differentiate among people, whether somebody is an IS fighter or is a Taliban or is a civilian, it's not going to differentiate. So here is a case where they themselves are also trying to take cover, and then they were trying to control. But unfortunately, last 2 to 3 days, especially when the two leaders who are on different notes ruling Afghanistan have come together and have arrived at some sort of power sharing, suddenly the Taliban has gone crazy again, and they've carried out suicide bomb attacks on one of the complexes, and they've done a lot of damage to this particular region itself, which is just opening up the different side of the problem itself. Now, the pandemic actually provides an opportunity for the Taliban to increase its legitimacy in the eyes of the local people with regard to if they're interested in governance, if they're interested in politics, if they want to take over. This they should have used in a different manner, where they should have stood by the people, they should have contributed. They have a massive amount of money. They could have easily given that money to or used that money to help the people and build something and then take care of. But even now, they're certainly not interested. That's a precarious scenario that we see here. And now, rather than that one, as I told you, they are continuing to fight and they're making situation much more vulnerable. And this is also the holy month. Unfortunately, they're carrying out attacks and other things and inflicting violence on people. I don't know when they claim that they're Muslims, when they claim that they're for the Sharia, they claim that they do everything according to the Quran. What exactly is going to happen? This type of violence certainly is not acceptable in any form, for that matter. Whatever the religiosity that they bring in, I don't think there is any sanction for anything of these things to carry out. In fact, they need to wage a jihad on themselves with regard to their heart, at least in the month of Ramadan, where they need to think about how they would not indulge in violence and other things. But unfortunately, that's not happening here. Now, since the Taliban announcement on the 1st April, the group has continued to engage in violence, as I told you, even where the places where the COVID-19 crisis is there. Now, overall, while the organized violence involving the Taliban has remained relatively low during April, but large scale of violence is engulfing here, which is also very, very problematic. Now, on the 23rd of April, if we have to look in, the Taliban rejected President Ghani's call for a ceasefire during Ramzan. As I told you, he was asking for it. This is also something that was reported by Al Jazeera, indicating that the group intends to continue to pressure the beleaguered Afghan state as the negotiations were continuing at that particular point. And now, despite international humanitarian calls for a ceasefire that would allow them to handle the crisis in a different way, they haven't heeded to anything that is associated with the pandemic. They just are not able to understand what they're doing to their own people is not acceptable, and this is still continuing. Now, we are aware that why they had rejected the the whole ceasefire. They had put up asking for release of their own prisoners and other things, and that was not agreed by the government. But the government wasn't ready to go anything with the ceasefire itself, because they felt somewhere that they were no way associated. They were not part of the ceasefire. Why would they actually do, and on whose behalf they have to do for something that they thought at that particular point of time? And subsequently, we had a lot of attacks and other things that had happened, due to which it became much more precarious and problematic. This is a simple map that you can see, a sort of a graph that shows the organized violence involving the Taliban from the 1st of September 19th to 2020. In this one, actually, the graphs shows somewhere in April it has come down, where you can see the Taliban announcement that came on the 29th of March, that they would not indulge too much into, but at the same time not making it too clear how they would deal with. But it had come down, but in last 2 to 3 days, again it has risen. Again, it has gone to an unprecedented level. With every attack, they think that they become much more relevant. Now, this is another thing that we understand in psychology of terrorism, where some of them try to become relevant in international relations, or for that matter in international affairs, by trying to inflict violence, because anyway they cannot carry out governance. Anyway, they can't do good things to the people. So the better way to is carry out spectacular attacks and then be relevant, so that people keep talking to you. You occupy their mind space. That is the idea behind when we talk about some of these conflicts, which are very interesting. So you can look at here. Since the April 3rd, the type of violence that is involved, you can see all those blue dots are the places that are seen here. At the same time, you have the number of COVID cases. Now, India has played a great role. Now, that's something that Taliban should have appreciated. Now, Taliban is telling that they are ready, and they even spoke about some of the issues, including that of Kashmir, saying that it's an internal issue. Now we don't know what is coming here. In fact, in one of my class this morning, my students asked, saying that if Taliban is doing this one, what is going to be India's response? Now, this is a game. This is a trap, actually. If Taliban says this one, Indian government feels overwhelmed and it tries getting involved, or it tries going for a negotiation. Taliban has nothing to lose. Taliban is not responsible to anyone. Taliban doesn't go for elections. Taliban doesn't bother about anything that's happening. So in such scenario, what is Taliban going to do? After a particular point of time, when India starts claiming that our talks are very successful, our talks are going great, they will pull off. And then Indians are made to, or Indian government is made to look like a fool. And then what happens, because we also had directly gone to deal with them, the Afghan government would feel offended. The Afghan government would take offense to it, and it would say, our long-term friend whom we trusted so much went on and had a negotiation with the Taliban. So what happens is, neither you're with the Taliban nor with the Afghan government. Rather than that one, India probably is well aware of the type of trap that Afghanistan or for that matter Taliban keeps laying, but at the same time it would not probably reject it or say, or it may say the time is not ripe, or India is looking at options and other things. It would not directly indulge and say we are least interested in any of these things, or we are not going to, this is a terrorist organization, we will not do that. It's not going to say that one only, because you don't know when they will come and sit in the helm of affairs. Now that's another limitation that we would find here, due to which now Taliban is also not ready to succumb to the pressure. You have the Afghan government going a little more stronger with the power sharing that's happening now. They want to consolidate and give some sort of governance to the people, rather than making it to look like the whole political landscape is divided in Afghanistan. They're trying to give this sort of a scenario. Now that's the thing that probably I thought I'll share with you people, and then the 4 scenarios that I was actually trying to look at. This is my last slide. This is like a conclusion as well. I was trying to look at. Now each of you can think and respond, as well as vote whatever that you want to. You can take further how you want to understand this one, because I have never believed in any of the webinars or seminars to conclude anything just like that, because anything that we conclude conveniently would not allow you to think further. If you are a keen student, you will certainly go a little more deeper, and then look at more problems. So my idea essentially in every presentation that we do is to pose more questions, make things that are a bit more, or make things a bit more precarious, and allow you to think what can be the options that are available, what are possibilities that can happen, is something that we look at. So these are 4 scenarios that I was trying to show you people at the end, but I don't see the presentation here.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore. I'll just ask our team to just put up the 4 scenarios where our participants can vote for, and then probably we can just carry on with the Q&A, starting with the scenarios where you can explain what is the most interested scenario for our participants. Can we have the scenario on the screen, please? Yeah, thank you. I urge our participants to please read the scenarios, and based on the presentation, whichever scenario you feel requires much more deliberation, you can vote for it, and we will start a Q&A session with that particular scenario.
Yeah, so I'm actually giving the first scenario is Libya has completely lost itself in governance due to conflicting claims between 2 different parties. Now, extra-regional powers like Russia and Turkey are out to flex their muscles there. What would be the response from Algeria and Egypt in a regional conflict scenario towards Libya and Turkey? Now, that's my first question, because the 2 stakeholders who are facing this problem because of the maritime arrangement that happened between Turkey and Libya are Algeria and Egypt. Both of them have taken offense to it, apart from Israel and few others, because of the territorial waters that they talk about, and the maritimity and many other things that are involved. Now, what will happen? How will these 2 regional powers, that means those 2 who share the borders with, how are they going to actually respond to this, is my first scenario. Now, the second scenario is where I'm looking at where there is this particular geostrategic rivalry due to COVID-19 engulfing a failing globalization pattern among developed and developing nations, and weakening governance capacity of competing states, leading to some sort of interstate conflicts. What would happen if this reaches a critical level? What if people find this as an opportunity to make it problematic? What would actually happen is another scenario that I'm trying to give you people. The third scenario is the Saudi-led coalition has continued to wage its campaign against Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, resulting in heavy civilian casualties. Neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia are in a position to give up on the proxy war or carry forward due to the COVID-19 crisis. Will Yemenis get a chance to resolve it by themselves, or has their capacity to govern themselves been forgotten for a long time? Now, what happens is also when you are not in power or when you are not in governance, when you are not used to the regular way of ruling yourself, after a point of time you forget. That's what I tell all the students. Once in a while, at least, learn how to write, because people have got used to typing. So once in a while, if you don't write, you will end up forgetting how to write. Your hands may actually shiver in front of people, where they may think that you are into weed, or they may also think that you are into substance abuse and many other things. So have the MNEs forgotten actually how to govern themselves, or will they be able to do, is the next scenario. So the fourth scenario is there is a talk of changing leadership in Syria by Russia, Turkey, and Iran to bring an end to the violence that has completed a decade without a solution. Will this lead to peace or further conflict and push Syria into a new Iraq? I'm using the word Iraq very clearly because regime change has its own consequences. Regime change is problematic. So that's the reason I'm asking how this is going to pan out is something that I'm trying to push. Will they create a new Iraq, or will they allow Assad to do whatever that he's doing and look at other possible options? How are they going to come together and get rid of the proxies, get rid of all those problematic ones, and how they're going to lead is something that I'm submitting to you people. So now you're free to ask questions according to the way the moderator wants it to be.
Thank you. So I would just request our participants to just vote for each of the scenarios. There's a button over there where you press, and you can just go down to the end of the page and submit, so that we know which scenario we can proceed from, and Dr. Kishore can actually answer whichever you would like to need more in depth to understand. We take just a few minutes. But thank you so much, Dr. Kishore. It was remarkably an interesting presentation. And if you ask me some of the key takeaways until people vote for it, according to me, apart from the theoretical construct or the analytical framework that you provided, I can highlight that one of the areas, such as Libya, for instance, we have seen a conflict zone such as Libya. There have been additional stresses, if you see, including infighting and bombing of hospitals and facilities, for instance. And also, we have seen an interesting scenario where we have seen essential resources such as water also, which has been used to intimidate already vulnerable populations. So addition of COVID-19 is also one more burden on the population over there. But thank you. But one of the points which I like to add also to this, so that we can take the discussion forward, is that we should remember, especially when we are also looking at the West Asian region, is that a deteriorating socio-economic condition can be a spark to light the prairie fire, as they say, right? So West Asia, unfortunately, is still facing the brunt of what was started at the Arab Spring in Tunisia. Now, these are interesting ways in which geopolitics can have the ability to transform conflicts. So if we can just have the result of the poll on the screen, if all our participants have voted. Yes. So I think the overwhelming number of votes are for the second scenario, actually. That is, there is a geostrategic rivalry due to COVID-19 engulfing a failing globalization pattern among developed and developing nations, and weakening governance capacity of competing states, leading to interstate conflicts. What would happen if this reaches a critical level? So this is one of the questions which all our participants are much more interested in knowing. So if you can shed a light on that, after that we will move on to the Q&A.
No problem, no issues at all. I anticipated somehow, because from the perspective of business to all of these, it's a very important scenario, and it's also a critical juncture, because those of them who were leading from the front, who were leading the business, and these were the people now who have no what is the answer to many of these things on the one hand. Second is also when the governance structure starts becoming weak, and the smaller type of problems that some of these states had, when these economic vulnerabilities become more and more problematic, when they are unable to manage, there is this manifestation that can come in to divert the attention. There are possibilities that the states may turn them into conflicts. They may run towards the conflicts to divert their attention. That's one of the ways of looking at it. Second, in reality, also they not have enough money to feed their people. They may not have enough money to invest in social components to all other things that we regularly look at. Third, when your public distribution systems to many other ones which are part of the welfare state actually start failing, that may also lead to. Now, you as a state, you may not be in a position to go public and say you are scarcity. If you say that one, then it simply shows that you're weak. So how do you do this one? So then what happens is you will start having syndicates. Now these are the syndicates, what they think is for their own survival, they start creating newer groups and then they start exploiting the people. So when people start exploiting, states are trying to exploit the maximum situation and from the people, there is exploitation everywhere. But unfortunately, these are the same group of states and the people who are saying for some time ago that globalization is an exploitation. But now they realize that globalization actually is not an exploitation. Not having globalization will lead to exploitation. That is the type of problem that we would find. So now we will start realizing how important was globalization, how important was having resources, how important it was for having food security, water security, to all sorts of securities that were kept aside, and some other securities were much more important. Now, given that, it is going to become much more precarious. More so specifically talking about West Asia, now it will become in some time to come, especially in those comparatively fragile states, it's going to be sort of a right. It's going to be run for all. Whosoever wants to exploit whatever they want to, they can do so. So nobody is going to stop them. Nobody is going to actually control them, is a scenario that we are able to say. Now, who will come and do this one? Will United States now come and say probably there is a problem in West Asia, I'll come and intervene? I don't think they have a position, neither they have a capacity to do so. Now that's an advantage many groups will find and they try utilizing. That's what I was trying to explain with regard to the Syrian scenario. With the pandemic coming in, with the fear that is running around, ISIS is consolidating. ISIS is trying to come back. ISIS is trying to take control over certain regions. Now, the failure of globalization is not just about economic welfare, it's not just about money, it's also about free movement of the people, movement of goods, movement of capital, movement of services. It is in everything, right? Now, all the four different type of movements that I'm talking about is going to be severely affected, due to which this pandemic is going to play havoc, in which probably we will see the strain of the globalization will lead to the strain on the humanity itself.
Thank you so much, Professor Kishore. I think that was a very elaborate, but at the same time to the point, and it touches upon many areas. So we have a bunch of questions here. This is just from the first round which we put across. So I think we would just about have time for about 4 questions. But if we are able to, we will surely accommodate some more. Or otherwise, you can always write to us, and we will pass on the message to the presenter, and you will get the reply to your questions. So, sir, since you started out from the perspective of an analytical framework, or how do we actually look at conflict and conflict areas, there is one question which is more at a global level, or level of theory. So I would like to start with that question to you.
Yes.
The question is, many a times we see the third world countries work on inter-nation simulation ideology. Many a times we see that intra-territorial disputes invoke unrest and conflicts in areas outside the territory. Can deficiency to avoid such situations be viewed as a manifestation of political violence?
Can you repeat the last part again?
Can deficiency to avoid such situations be viewed as a manifestation of political violence?
It is a political violence. As I was mentioning to people in the beginning itself, there is this principal agent problem that I'm talking about, where if you don't fulfill a particular mandate, if you don't fulfill something that you have said, it's not that everything you're going to fulfill, at least the basics of basics, if you don't fulfill, it leads to political violence. It is considered as political violence. And that would be very, very problematic in the times to come.
Right, sir. So another interesting question we have is actually from an area which was not covered by you, but you
Mhm.
had indicated on the map, which is Venezuela. So
Mhm.
I thought that for the benefit of the audience, and we can observe one more of an area and know your expertise on that. The question is, I would like to have your views on COVID and a troubled country like mine. This gentleman is from Venezuela, and
Okay.
even if we are not at war but under threats from US and sanctioned in different levels.
Mhm. No,
So
no. See, Venezuela's case is so precarious. In fact, they should have been probably champions of what is the liquid that we talk about, or they should have been champions of what is the oil industry as such. If they would have probably properly exploited what they have. But unfortunately, the type of scenario that has come in when they have poor leadership on one hand, then you also have threatening external players who are also trying to punch the bag in whatever the way that is possible. And on top of it, now you have a crisis also coming in, a pandemic coming in. I think it's too many problems. One problem itself, where nation would not be in a position to handle. When you have too many players trying to mess up, I think it becomes very, very problematic. I think his question is so valid that, or rather, more of a comment that Venezuela, what answer it would have probably is or it rests in his own question of choosing what type of political community that they require. What exactly is the political culture that they have in their country? Has the political culture changed at all? Or the political culture would ever lead to bringing those people who are responsible? How do they bring those competitive political cultures within their country is probably depends on them, their voting behavior, and whom they want to be ruling.
right, so in another, I'll just club two questions basically.
Mhm.
They're on the issue of refugees.
Mhm.
So whenever we have looked at any of these areas, whether it's from Syria or from Yemen or from Afghanistan, we have seen the issue of refugees coming up, and the whole geopolitics behind that. But here the question is twofold, basically. From one of our participants is clearly asking us, how will the lack of public health infrastructure, displacement, and general situation where it is difficult to implement protection measures take a toll on refugees? How will terror groups take advantage of that? So, for instance, if we see that now we know very well that countries such as Yemen face it very difficult to manage a pandemic, which we saw with the cholera outbreak, which happened in Yemen a few
Mhm.
years back. So, with this aspect, how do conflict zones, how do terror groups? For you also mentioned about the regrouping of ISIS, and they're trying to regroup. So, how do terror groups take advantage of such situations?
See, one of the things that we read in terrorism literature and often also share with people is terrorists actually look for civil unrest. Terrorists will promote more and more refugee crisis. Terrorists would create scenarios where the state would not be in a position to take care of them, because the refugee camps are one of the places where the recruitment happens. This is something that is a very important factor. A lot of people haven't understood. How do they get people to fight in Palestine? How do they get people to fight in different places? The major place that they go try looking is in Africa, where they have these refugee camps, where they would tell that we will not only take you as part of our recruitment to the organization, but we will also pay you, where you can take care of your family. They may not be in this bad condition. So the person actually feels persuaded that he is getting a job. One, second, he may take the family out of such type of a crisis or a scenario. So he feels vulnerable at that moment, and he joins the gang, or he joins the terrorist organization. Second place is prison. I'm not dealing with that one anyway. But refugee camps are very, very important places where, because one, you are under frustration. You are frustrated against your civilian government because they have not been able to do anything to you. You're frustrated about international organizations. You're frustrated about your own life, and you don't find any purpose. In such scenario, somebody comes and says that here is a time where you can take revenge. Here is a time where you can actually pay back to everything that this particular government has done. Third, on top of it, you will also get, okay, it will also tell that you will also get Jannah or the heaven. So who would resist that one? So you have the combo that comes in as part of your meal. You would never say no to it. So that's one of the reasons these people become very, very vulnerable. And the refugee camps are also the places of abuse for a lot of terrorist organizations. These are the place where they can just run a riot because no civilian government gives this thing, what is a security to them. They can go just pick women as and when they want to. They can fancy around and then they'll again come and throw them back, or they can take them as slaves. They can do whatever they want to because nobody would because in a family of 5 and they come into a refugee camp, if they pick one, the family actually feels they have left out 4, so we need to be grateful to them. That's the sort of mentality that comes in, because I'm a student of refugee studies, and I've been with all sort of international organizations. We have looked at the UN itself in a little more detailed way, the type of studies that have been done. Now, these are the psychological components that least of the time are understood by the civilian government. How actually things run into a refugee's mind. It's very easy. A lot of people tend to say refugees and national security, refugees are a threat to this and that one, but they don't understand it is the state that creates avenue for many of these people to join this. It is the state that fails in its duty as part of the social contract, and then it only ends up blaming. So that's how refugee camps become a breeding ground. Plus, terrorist organization love terror. This is what is a refugee camps.
Right. So, just if you have seen, for instance, in Europe, this whole issue, COVID-19 issue and the refugee issue combined has caused a lot of frictions for European frontline states, such as Greece, for instance, which is housing a lot of refugees. So, one of the allegations, for instance, by some tabloid newspapers started this in Greece, where they accused Turkey of deliberately sending refugees with the COVID virus into their country and disposing of them from Turkey. So there is a question on the similar lines. Have there been any efforts to alternatively accommodate refugees that might be otherwise turned away from borders in fear of carrying the virus? Have there been any such instances? Is the question.
Oh, now this is interesting. I'll tell you. One, now the now one of the phenomena that we are able to witness is also that the states are becoming nationalistic.
Right.
Now, nationalistic from the perspective, suddenly you will see some sort of an activism that happens. So I'll give you an example of India. Now, everybody across the globe are aware that this virus came from China and it originated elsewhere, and China did not act upon, did not disclose, and otherwise it would have been contained, and nothing would have happened to the other parts of the world. Is something a regular phenomena that you would find. Now, what will the nationalistic group does or do with this one? Now they will try bringing the nationalism component to this one, and it says buy local, make local, and save the country. Okay. Now this is another sort of nationalism that comes in. This may not sustain for a long time because we may not be a good manufacturing hub. Now this nationalism in developed countries across Europe, let's imagine, or those some of them are developing. In those nations, it can turn out to be little different. How, if I ask me, one, they would say that these are the people who are carrying a virus and they are coming in. Second, they would also say these people are also people who are coming from certain areas or pockets that are supposed to be the breeding grounds, or this is a scenario that the states will be working on the humanitarian component so they can sneak in certain people is also another way of looking at it. Because if one or few patients come in with this type of virus, they can actually create a havoc. So it's very, very natural way of responding from many of these states that they are not doing. The second is an interesting component. Some of these states which are not actually doing economically well, they purposefully deny entry to many of these people, or they make it to look like an international news. Ask me why. The issue is that they want international organizations to pump them money. You went to pump money. They have to tell Greece, please do something. Nobody else is doing. You are the one whom they are approaching to. We will give you money. So anyway, you are doing something on a regular basis, whether you do or not, it's going to happen. Now, what you do is you make it to look like you are handling a scenario, get a lot of money, and then whether you give it to people or not, at least the political class will eat it. This is another way actually a lot of countries survive. In fact, Turkey is one of the major ones. Turkey arm twists Europe every time, saying that now I am having the Syrian refugees coming in. If you don't fund me, I will leave them to Europe because Turkey is the gateway to Europe. So it says, I will leave these people. I will not handle them here. Now, what the European Union did, they all together collected money, like those people who are pissed off with or who are scared of refugees, as if they are going to do something to them, and they told them, don't send them to European Union. You keep them. You make camps. You create facilities. We will give you a huge sum of money. So Erdogan is arm twisting, and every time he's telling, if you don't give me money, I'll send them inside, or I will just let them loose. So there's a lot more politics to it also. It's not as plain as we look at. So there are countries which play politics with this because they also get funding. Second, they also get mileage. They also get public funding apart from the funding that comes from many of these organizations or international organizations.
So I think we have time for only this one last question. Like I said, the others can mail us your questions. We will send it to Dr. Kishore, and you will get a reply to them. The last question, basically, on is a more I would say a philosophical question when considering violence, conflict, and war. So the question is that definitely we had seen some impact of conflict in Yemen. It still looks like the conflict will last for a very long time. Are there any examples from history to understand how such a conflict will ever come to an end?
Can you read the question again?
While a pandemic such as COVID-19 has definitely had some impact on the conflict in Yemen, it still looks like the conflict will last for a very long time. Are there any examples from history to understand how such a conflict will come to an end?
Oh no, least of the places. Either they have to get wiped out completely and then you have somebody else as a foreign ruler coming in, or they need to have an extremely powerful dictator coming and taking over. That's a possibility. This is something that we have seen in times when there was no stability. There are leaders who came in and gave stability. I can give you example of Gaddafi. I can give you example of Hosni Mubarak, and these were the conditions when these countries were not very stable, but they were not as bad as Yemen today, but they were also going through certain crises. It is at that point of time, some of these people came in and then they provided stability, whether we accept or not the dictatorship in whichever form, autocratic rule and everything, but at least 30, 40 years there was longevity. They knew there was only one leader, and at least they were conducting themselves in a way, because Libya grew so powerful. It started even pumping money to IRA. It started pumping money to every other leader that was possible. It was trying to show its own strength and different. So there is some amount of stability. That's what that comes in. That's why I was talking about Saddam Hussein in some of my webinars, where I was trying to tell that at least when that man was there, there were proper roads, flyovers, and basic facilities that were available. Now, with saying that they will change regime, what they have done is much more precarious than there is an ongoing conflict forever. On the ethical side of it, we can always talk about it. Is it right to allow Saddam Hussein to rule? Is it good to allow Xi Jinping to rule then in that case? Is it good to allow the guy in the Philippines to do that on the drug war that he is conducting and killing people left and right, and also claiming for the public chest thumping, saying that if my son is home tomorrow, I'll kill him also. That's what he says. And everybody feels moved. He's getting rid of all his political rivals. Everybody whom he doesn't want to be in Philippines, he's killing them. So if we can allow them and we think that they're all doing well, how are we allowing people in Brunei? How are we allowing people in many other parts of the world who are much more problematic? So I find least number of cases in the history where until and unless somebody extremely powerful comes in, takes over completely, there's no such solutions that we find in the history where the wars or the conflicts may simply just stop like that and then they may have peace. That's a rare, and this is also something to do to identity. That's what I'm trying to tell. That's why with regard to Yemen alone, I gave a bit of background by saying that 40% of the population, they were in the helm of affairs, in the social fabric to everything, and suddenly they're left out and they have been made to look like they're nothing in Yemen. That's when they actually started resenting. That's when they thought they need to get it back. And then on top of it, you have somebody like Iran coming in, and probably if the 79 revolution would not have been there was no Shia government. If there was no Shia government, there would have not been support to these people. So that would have been limited. So, but that is also not there. So it is difficult. Now, when you have external players getting involved, this is not going to die down immediately. Only solution we can think about is if the pandemic continues for a few more years, nobody will be left in Yemen. All of them will die. After that, peace will be restored.
That's a very somber note to end on, but I would just I would just ask my team to just display the ending poll which we have about the webinar before I conclude. Can we have that the poll, please? Thank you, Dr. Kishore. I would just request our participants to please vote on these questions. Your feedback is very important. Being an organization, we are always happy to take your feedback and improvise, if I can say, on this, on the topic or on the webinar or on the format. And I'm certain that you have found this presentation today to be very insightful. So it would be great for us also to know what you thought about that. Do answer all the questions and you can click submit at the end of the page. Okay, I think I would just move on now to conclude. Dr. Nandakishore, thank you. And unfortunately, due to the paucity of time, we will not be able to take more questions. However, like I've been telling you repeatedly, you may write to info@covins.com or to me. I will be sure to pass it on to him and address your query. As in all our webinars, we are happy to provide you with a certificate at the end of the webinar series for those who attend all the webinars. And apart from this webinar series, we have an ongoing webinar series organized by the CRNI DRDI division of COVINS on the theme, the approach and applicability, the best practices in counterterrorism. Our next upcoming webinar on that in that series is on Saturday. I hope you will join us then as well. And this series is focused and has very interesting themes. I would urge you to check it out. And finally, before concluding, I would like to highlight our next and concluding session in our COVID-19 and political risk webinar series, which will be a panel discussion along with esteemed speakers from India, China, and the US, who will address key issues on how COVID-19 has altered global order, especially useful in the interesting times that we live in. Once again, I thank you for joining us, and thank you, Professor Kishore, and thank you for all our audience.
Thank you so much. I would also put on record, I thank all of them who came to attend this one with so much of enthusiasm. I know people living in different parts of the world, from UK to India to Venezuela to all the places all over the world. Thank you for your interest, and I appreciate from deep of my heart, from depth of my heart, and thank you for being with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.